When billionaire tech CEO David Reynolds went live to investors, he thought he was untouchable, but his pregnant wife Sarah was watching from home, and what she saw in that hotel room background would destroy his empire forever. One live stream, one mistake, one woman who refused to stay silent. This is the story of how a betrayed wife brought federal agents to a family meeting and watched her husband's world collapse in real time. Hit that like button if you're ready for a story about justice, and don't forget to subscribe because you won't believe how this ends. Trust me, you need to hear every twist. Sarah Reynolds adjusted her pregnancy pillow for the third time in 10 minutes. Trying to find a comfortable position on the Italian leather sofa. 7 months pregnant and counting, she had grown accustomed to the aches and pains that came with carrying David's child. Their penthouse apartment in downtown Seattle overlooked Elliott Bay, a view that once filled her with pride but now felt as cold as the marble floors beneath her swollen feet. She reached for her laptop to check her husband's quarterly investor presentation. David Reynolds, founder and CEO of Nextech Solutions, was worth $2.3 billion, according to Forbes. At 38, he had built a tech empire that revolutionized cloud storage security. Sarah used to be his equal partner in ambition, a marketing executive with her own dreams before she gave it all up to support his vision. The live stream loaded with David's familiar, confident smile filling the screen. Behind him was what he always called his home office, though Sarah noticed something odd. The lighting was different, warmer than their sterile home setup. She squinted at the background, trying to identify what seemed off. Then she saw her. A woman's silhouette moved behind David, just barely visible in the reflection of a mirror. Sarah's heart stopped. The figure was slender, blonde, wearing what looked like a silk robe. Sarah knew that profile. She had seen it countless times in David's office. Ashley Morgan, his 26-year-old personal assistant. Sarah's hands trembled as she grabbed her phone, recording the screen. This was no home office. This was a hotel suite, while she sat here, heavy with his child, suffering through swollen ankles and morning sickness. David was presenting to investors from his mistress's bed. The camera angle shifted slightly, and Ashley became more visible, casually moving around what was clearly a hotel room. She even waved at someone off camera, completely unaware that thousands of investors were watching David's professional facade crumble in real time. Sarah felt the baby kick hard against her ribs, as if sensing her distress. Tears blurred her vision as months of suspicion crystallized into devastating reality. The late nights David claimed to spend at the office, the business trips that seemed to multiply, the way he barely touched her anymore. Claiming her pregnancy made him nervous. She thought about their wedding 5 years ago, when David whispered promises about building an empire together. She remembered signing that prenuptial agreement, trusting him completely when he said it was just a formality. Now that document felt like a noose around her neck. Her phone buzzed with a text from her sister Emma back in Detroit, watching David's presentation. "He looks good. You're so lucky." Lucky. Sarah almost laughed through her tears. The live stream ended with David's trademark confident sign-off. "As always, family comes first at Nextech. We build the future while protecting what matters most." Sarah slammed the laptop shut and struggled to her feet. The baby kicked again, harder this time, and she pressed her hand to her belly. "It's okay," she whispered. "Mommy's going to figure this out." But deep down, she knew nothing would ever be okay again. David had just destroyed their marriage on live television, and he didn't even realize it. David walked through the front door at 11:30 that night, his tie loosened and his hair slightly disheveled. Sarah sat waiting in their living room, her laptop open on the coffee table. The recorded live stream paused on the frame where Ashley was clearly visible. "You're up late," David said, not quite meeting her eyes as he poured himself a scotch from the bar cart. "Is the baby keeping you awake?" "Where were you today during your investor call?" Sarah asked, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her chest. David's hand paused on the crystal decanter. "My office, obviously. You know how these presentations work." Sarah turned the laptop screen toward him. "This is your office." The color drained from David's face as he saw the frozen image. For a moment, silence filled the room except for the ticking of their grandfather clock. Then David's expression hardened, and Sarah recognized the look that had terrified countless business competitors. "You're spying on me now," he said, his voice cold. "Recording my private business calls." Private. Sarah struggled to stand, her pregnancy making the movement awkward. "You were live streaming to thousands of people." Ashley was walking around in the background like she owned the place. David set down his glass and moved closer, his presence suddenly intimidating. "You're being paranoid. Pregnancy hormones can make women imagine things that aren't there. I have it recorded, David. I can see her clearly. What you think you see and what's actually happening are two different things," he said, his voice taking on that patronizing tone she had grown to hate. "Ashley was delivering documents to my hotel suite. I was working late preparing for the presentation." "In a hotel suite, why not your actual office?" David's jaw tightened. "Because I needed privacy to focus. Something that's apparently impossible in this house with you constantly questioning my every move." Sarah felt the familiar pattern beginning. David was gaslighting her again, making her doubt what she had seen with her own eyes. It was a technique she had watched him use on business rivals, slowly dismantling their confidence until they questioned their own judgment. "I know what I saw," she said firmly. "Do you?" David stepped closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Because from where I stand, I see a woman who's 7 months pregnant, isolated, spending too much time alone with her thoughts. Maybe we should have Dr. Martinez check if these paranoid episodes are affecting the baby." The threat was subtle but clear. Sarah's pregnancy had been complicated, requiring bed rest and careful monitoring. David was suggesting she was mentally unstable, laying groundwork to have her committed if she became too much trouble. "You're having an affair," she said, her voice breaking slightly. David laughed, but there was no warmth in it. "With Ashley. She's an employee. Sarah, a very efficient one who helps me run a billion-dollar company. If you're threatened by a working relationship, maybe the problem isn't me." He moved to the bar cart and refilled his glass, his movements casual and dismissive. "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to delete that recording, apologize for violating my privacy, and we're going to pretend this conversation never happened." "And if I don't?" David turned back to her, his smile cold and calculating. "Then you'll discover just how ironclad that prenuptial agreement really is. You signed away your rights to almost everything, including custody arrangements for children born during our marriage." Sarah's blood turned to ice. She had never read the fine print carefully, trusting David to protect her interests. The realization that she might have signed away her own child made her knees weak. "You wouldn't," she whispered. "I built this empire from nothing," David said, swirling the scotch in his glass. "I didn't get here by letting obstacles stand in my way. You can be part of my success, or you can be removed from it. Your choice." The baby kicked hard, and Sarah gasped, one hand flying to her belly. David didn't even glance her way. "Think carefully about your next move. Sarah, you're 7 months pregnant with no income, no career, and no legal claim to anything I've built. Ashley, on the other hand, is young, ambitious, and actually useful to my business. If you force me to choose between you, the decision won't be difficult." With that, he walked out of the room, leaving Sarah alone with the weight of his threats and the terrible knowledge that the man she had married no longer existed. 3 days later, Sarah sat across from Elena Vasquez in a coffee shop 20 minutes from her neighborhood. Elena was 42, sharp-featured, with silver streaks in her black hair that she wore like battle scars. She had built her reputation destroying powerful men in divorce court, and David's own lawyer had once called her the most dangerous woman in Seattle. "Show me what you have," Elena said without preamble. Sarah slid her phone across the small table, the recorded live stream ready to play. Elena watched in silence, occasionally making notes in her leather portfolio. When the video ended, she leaned back in her chair. "This is good, but it's not enough," Elena said bluntly. "David will claim it was an innocent business meeting. We need more." "Like what? Financial records, hotel receipts, phone records showing a pattern. Your husband is worth over $2 billion. He didn't get there by being careless, and he won't go down easy." Elena opened her portfolio and pulled out a thick document. "I've been researching your prenuptial agreement. It's brutal, but there are a few cracks we might be able to exploit." Sarah's heart lifted slightly. "Really? The adultery clause. If we can prove David committed adultery during your marriage, it voids several sections of the prenup, including the custody arrangements, but we need ironclad evidence." "How do we get that?" Elena smiled, and it was sharp as a blade. "We make him comfortable. Right now, he thinks you're beaten. Let him think that while we gather what we need." Over the next hour, Elena outlined their strategy. Sarah would appear to submit to David's demands while secretly documenting everything. Elena's private investigator would handle the technical surveillance. They would build a case methodically, the way Elena had learned to dismantle powerful men piece by piece. "One more thing," Elena said as they prepared to leave. "David has connections throughout the city. We need to assume he has people watching us. Be careful who you trust." Sarah nodded, feeling hope for the first time in days. She wasn't alone anymore. That evening, she confronted David again, but this time with a different script. She apologized for her accusations, blamed her pregnancy hormones, and deleted the recording in front of him. David accepted her surrender with smug satisfaction. "I'm glad you came to your senses," he said, pulling her close in a rare display of affection. "After the baby comes, we'll get you some help. Postpartum depression can be serious." Sarah smiled and nodded. Even as her blood boiled, David was already planning to have her declared mentally incompetent after she gave birth, but now she knew what he was planning, and Elena would be ready. For 3 weeks, their plan worked perfectly. Elena's investigator, Marcus, gathered hotel receipts showing David's frequent stays at the Four Seasons. They documented Ashley's presence through security footage and credit card records showing David purchasing expensive jewelry and clothing that never appeared in their home. Sarah played her part perfectly, acting like the submissive wife while secretly recording David's phone calls and photographing suspicious documents. The evidence file grew thicker each day. Then everything fell apart. "We have a problem," Elena said when Sarah arrived at their usual coffee shop. Elena's face was pale, her usual confidence shaken. "What kind of problem?" "I've been disbarred, effective immediately." Sarah's coffee cup slipped from her hands, shattering on the floor. "What?" "Anonymous complaint filed yesterday. Claims I've been bribing witnesses and falsifying evidence. Complete fabrication, but the ethics board acted faster than I've ever seen. Someone with serious influence pushed this through. The blood drained from Sarah's face. David knows. Elena nodded grimly. He knows everything. Our meetings, the investigation, probably every conversation we've had. I'm sorry, Sarah. I failed you. As Elena spoke, Sarah's phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. Your recording was impressive. Hope you enjoyed your coffee. Love, David. Sarah looked around the coffee shop wildly, realizing they were being watched at that very moment. David hadn't just discovered their plan. He had been controlling it from the beginning. Sarah returned home to find David waiting in their living room with two men in expensive suits. One was his personal lawyer, Richard Sterling. The other introduced himself as Dr. Harrison Webb, a psychiatrist. Sit down, Sarah, David said, his voice gentle but firm. We need to talk. Sarah's hands trembled as she lowered herself into a chair. The baby seemed to sense her distress, kicking restlessly against her ribs. Dr. Webb specializes in pregnancy-related mental health issues, David continued. I've been concerned about your recent behavior, the paranoid accusations, the secret recordings, hiring a lawyer to spy on me. Dr. Webb leaned forward with practiced sympathy. These symptoms are more common than you might think. Mrs. Reynolds. Prenatal depression combined with hormonal changes can create elaborate delusions about infidelity and persecution. I'm not delusional, Sarah said, but her voice sounded weak, even to her own ears. Richard Sterling placed a folder on the coffee table. We have documentation of your recent erratic behavior, hiring Elena Vasquez under false pretenses, creating fabricated evidence against your husband. These actions suggest a serious break from reality. Sarah stared at the folder, knowing it contained a twisted version of the truth. Every move she had made to protect herself was being reframed as evidence of mental illness. The good news, Dr. Webb continued, is that this is treatable. I recommend immediate intervention to protect both you and the baby. Voluntary commitment to a specialized facility where you can receive proper care. Voluntary, Sarah whispered. David's expression was sympathetic, but his eyes were cold. Of course. Though if you refuse treatment, I'll have no choice but to seek an involuntary commitment order. For the baby's safety. Sarah understood the trap perfectly. Submit to voluntary psychiatric treatment, or be declared legally incompetent. Either way, David would have complete control over her and their child. I need time to think, she said. I'm afraid we can't wait, Richard Sterling said. Mrs. Reynolds' condition appears to be deteriorating rapidly. For everyone's safety, we need to act immediately. As they spoke, Sarah noticed David's phone buzzing repeatedly with text messages. Each time, his smile grew wider. She realized he was receiving updates about something else, something that gave him obvious pleasure. Actually, David said, standing and straightening his tie. Before we proceed, there's something we need to attend to tonight. The Pediatric Cancer Research Gala. I'm receiving the Humanitarian of the Year award. Sarah stared at him in disbelief. You want me to go to a charity gala now? I want you to remember your role as my wife, David said firmly. Tonight, you'll smile, look beautiful, and show everyone that the Reynolds family is strong and united. Tomorrow, we'll get you the help you need. Sarah realized this was another calculated move. David wanted to parade her in public one last time before having her committed. A final humiliation to cement his narrative of the unstable wife who needed to be protected from herself. 2 hours later, Sarah found herself in their master bedroom, struggling to fit into a formal gown that no longer accommodated her pregnant belly. David had hired a team of stylists who worked around her obvious distress, creating the illusion of the glowing, expectant mother. You look beautiful, David said when she emerged, but his eyes were looking past her, already focused on the performance ahead. The gala was held at the Four Seasons, the same hotel where David had been conducting his affair. Sarah recognized several staff members who nodded respectfully at David, confirming what she already knew about his frequent visits. The ballroom glittered with Seattle's most powerful citizens, tech executives, politicians, judges, and media personalities all gathered to celebrate David's philanthropic contributions. Sarah stood beside him during his acceptance speech, her smile frozen in place as he spoke about the importance of family and protecting children. "My wife Sarah has been my inspiration throughout this journey," David said, placing his hand on her shoulder with obvious possession. "Even now, as she prepares to bring our first child into the world, she reminds me daily of what truly matters." The applause was thunderous. Cameras flashed as David pulled Sarah close, the image of the perfect power couple expecting their first child. But then David's expression changed. His confident smile faltered as he looked toward the ballroom entrance. Sarah followed his gaze and saw a young woman approaching, someone she didn't recognize but who clearly knew David very well. The woman was perhaps 25, with David's same green eyes and stubborn jawline. She walked with purpose through the crowd, ignoring the whispers that followed in her wake. David's hand tightened painfully on Sarah's shoulder as the stranger reached the stage. In the sudden silence, her voice carried clearly throughout the ballroom. "Hello, Dad," she said. "I think it's time we had a talk." The ballroom fell into absolute silence as every head turned toward the young woman on the stage. David's face went white, his grip on Sarah's shoulder tightening to the point of pain. "Jessica," he whispered, barely audible. "Jessica Reynolds," she said clearly, speaking to the crowd as much as to David. "Your daughter, the one you abandoned when I was 8 years old." Sarah felt the floor seem to shift beneath her feet. David had never mentioned having a daughter. In 5 years of marriage, through countless conversations about their future family, he had never once mentioned that he already had a child. Security guards moved toward the stage, but Jessica held up her hand. "I wouldn't," she said calmly. "Not unless you want every major news outlet in Seattle to hear what I have to say." David found his voice. "This is neither the time nor the place for family discussions." "Isn't it?" Jessica's smile was razor sharp. "A gala celebrating your humanitarian work, your speech about protecting children. Seems like perfect timing to me." She turned to address the crowd directly. "Ladies and gentlemen, allow me to share what kind of father your humanitarian of the year really is. When my mother died of cancer 12 years ago, David here promised to take care of me. Instead, he shipped me off to boarding school and disappeared from my life entirely. No visits, no calls, no support payments, nothing." The crowd began murmuring, phones appearing as people started recording. Sarah saw David's carefully constructed public image beginning to crumble in real time. "But I didn't give up on him," Jessica continued. "I put myself through college, got a degree in computer science, and found a way to stay close to him. For the past 3 years, I've been working at Seattle General Hospital as a systems technician, close enough to watch, close enough to learn." David's voice was strained. "Security, please escort this woman out." "I wouldn't do that if I were you," Jessica said pleasantly. "Not when I have such interesting recordings to share. Would you like to hear some highlights? Or should I save them for the FBI?" David's face went from white to gray. Sarah watched in fascination as the most powerful man she knew was reduced to helplessness by a 25-year-old woman he had abandoned. "You see?" Jessica said, pulling out her phone. Working in hospital IT gives you access to all sorts of interesting systems, including the financial networks that process payments for private medical facilities, like the ones you've been using to hide money from the IRS. The crowd's murmur grew louder. Sarah saw several prominent business people edging toward the exits, distancing themselves from whatever scandal was about to unfold. Jessica continued, "For 3 years, I've been documenting your embezzlement from Next Tech Solutions, your tax evasion schemes, and your plans to frame your business partner Michael Carter for your own crimes, all waiting for the right moment to act." She looked directly at Sarah then, her expression softening slightly. "I'm sorry you got caught up in this. You seem like a decent person. You deserve better than him." David finally found his voice, but it came out as a croak. "What do you want? Justice," Jessica said simply. "For my mother, who died believing you'd take care of me. For me, who spent 15 years wondering why my father threw me away. And for her." She nodded toward Sarah, who's about to discover just how far you're willing to go to protect yourself. She pressed a button on her phone, and speakers around the ballroom crackled to life with David's voice. "Sarah's becoming a problem. After the baby comes, we'll have her committed permanently. Ashley will be a much better mother anyway." The crowd gasped. Sarah felt the blood drain from her face as her worst fears were confirmed in David's own words. But Jessica wasn't finished. Another recording began. "Michael thinks he's smart, but I've been setting him up for months. When the FBI investigation starts, all the evidence will point to him. He'll take the fall for everything." The ballroom erupted into chaos. Guests rushed toward exits, phones buzzing with calls to lawyers and accountants. Security guards stood frozen, unsure whether to protect David or arrest him. Through it all, Jessica stood calmly on the stage, watching her father's empire collapse around him. "The FBI received copies of everything 20 minutes ago," she announced. "They should be arriving any moment." As if summoned by her words, federal agents began streaming through the ballroom entrances, badges visible, radios crackling with coordinated activity. David turned to run, but there was nowhere to go. He was surrounded by the very people he had been planning to destroy, his crimes broadcast to everyone who mattered in his world. Sarah watched in stunned silence as the man she had feared, the man who had controlled every aspect of her life, was reduced to a cornered animal with no escape. Jessica stepped down from the stage and approached Sarah gently. "Are you okay?" "The baby?" Sarah realized she was crying. One hand pressed to her belly where the baby was kicking frantically. "I don't understand. Why did you wait so long? Why didn't you expose him years ago?" Jessica's smile was sad but determined. "Because I needed him to commit crimes serious enough to put him away forever. Abandoning a daughter isn't illegal. Tax evasion and embezzlement are federal crimes. I wanted to make sure he could never hurt anyone else the way he hurt us." As FBI agents approached David with handcuffs, Sarah realized her nightmare was ending in a way she had never imagined possible. She wasn't being saved by a lawyer or her own strength. She was being rescued by a daughter seeking justice for all the women David had destroyed. Federal agents swarmed the ballroom as guests scattered like leaves in a hurricane. Sarah found herself guided to a quiet corner by Jessica, who seemed remarkably calm considering she had just destroyed her father's life in front of half of Seattle's power structure. "We need to get you to a hospital," Jessica said, noting how Sarah was gripping her belly. "The stress isn't good for the baby." "I'm okay," Sarah managed, though she wasn't sure that was true. "I just need to understand what's happening." Agent Martinez, a stern-faced woman in her 40s, approached them with a tablet in her hands. "Mrs. Reynolds, I'm Special Agent Martinez with the FBI Financial Crimes Division. We need to ask you some questions. But first, are you in immediate medical distress? Sarah shook her head, though the baby's increasingly frantic movement suggested otherwise. Your husband has been under investigation for 18 months, Agent Martinez explained. Ms. Reynolds here. She nodded toward Jessica. Contacted us 3 years ago with initial evidence. We've been building a case ever since. Sarah looked at Jessica in amazement. You've been planning this for 3 years. Jessica's expression was complicated, mixing determination with old pain. After Mom died, I had nothing left except anger. I could have sued him for abandonment, but civil courts wouldn't have been enough. I wanted him to face the same kind of powerlessness he forced on us. Agent Martinez continued, the evidence, Ms. Reynolds provided documents systematic embezzlement of over $50 million from Nextech Solutions, tax evasion on a massive scale, and conspiracy to frame Michael Carter for his crimes. Michael Carter? Sarah asked, confused. David's business partner, Jessica explained. The one person who might have been able to expose him. David's been setting him up as the fall guy for months. As they spoke, Sarah watched federal agents leading David through the ballroom in handcuffs. His face was pale, his usual confidence completely shattered. When he saw her watching, he tried to speak, but an agent guided him firmly toward the exit. What happens to me now? Sarah asked. To the baby. Agent Martinez consulted her tablet. The prenuptial agreement is void due to fraud. Everything your husband obtained through illegal means is subject to seizure, but anything legitimately earned remains marital property. You'll need a good attorney. Sarah almost laughed. The one I hired was disbarred because of David. Actually, Agent Martinez said with a slight smile, Elena Vasquez's disbarment was based on fabricated evidence. She's been reinstated as of this afternoon. Seems someone with federal connections vouched for her integrity. Jessica raised her hand slightly. I may have mentioned to Agent Martinez that you deserved proper representation. Before Sarah could respond, a commotion near the ballroom entrance drew their attention. Ashley Morgan was trying to leave quietly, but hotel security had stopped her at the request of federal agents. We need to speak with Ms. Morgan as well, Agent Martinez said. She's been involved in laundering money through shell companies. Sarah watched Ashley being escorted back into the ballroom, her confident facade cracking as reality set in. The woman who had thought she was stealing a billionaire husband was discovering she had actually been dating a federal criminal. I have a question, Sarah said to Jessica. Why did you reveal yourself tonight? You could have let the FBI arrest him quietly. Jessica was quiet for a moment. Because I wanted him to see me destroy him. I wanted everyone who enabled him, everyone who praised him, to know exactly what kind of man he really was. And she looked at Sarah's pregnant belly. I wanted to make sure his next victim knew she wasn't alone. The words hit Sarah like a physical blow, but not a painful one. For months, she had felt completely isolated, convinced she was the only person who saw through David's charm, knowing that someone else understood, someone who had suffered even longer, made her feel less crazy. What happens to Nextech? Sarah asked. Agent Martinez answered. Michael Carter is assuming temporary control pending investigation. The company itself appears to be legitimate. It was just being used to hide illegal activities. Sarah's head was spinning. In the space of 2 hours, her entire world had been turned upside down. The husband who had threatened to have her committed was now facing decades in federal prison. The company that had supported their lavish lifestyle was under federal investigation. The prenuptial agreement that had terrified her was void. But more than that, she had discovered she wasn't as alone as she had thought. Jessica's courage had saved not just Sarah, but potentially countless other victims of David's manipulation. "I think," Sarah said slowly, "I need to sit down." Jessica immediately took her arm, guiding her to a chair. "The paramedics are here. Let them check you and the baby." As medical personnel surrounded her, Sarah caught Jessica's hand. "Thank you," she whispered, "for waiting, for planning, for saving us." Jessica squeezed her hand gently. "Thank you for giving me a reason to finally act. Knowing he was going to do to you what he did to me and my mom made it personal." Sarah realized that David's greatest crime wasn't fraud or tax evasion. It was his complete inability to value the people who loved him, his willingness to destroy anyone who stood between him and what he wanted. But that same blindness had been his downfall. He had never seen Jessica as a threat because he had never seen her as a person worth considering. His arrogance had created the very enemy who would bring him down. 2 weeks after David's arrest, Sarah sat in Elena Vasquez's office, trying to process the avalanche of legal documents spread across the conference table. The baby had dropped lower, making walking uncomfortable, but her due date was still 3 weeks away. "The federal seizure is extensive, but fair," Elena explained, pointing to various highlighted sections. "Everything purchased with embezzled funds goes to the government. Everything legitimately earned remains marital property, which means it's yours." "How much?" Sarah asked, almost afraid to hear the answer. "Approximately $400 million in legitimate assets," Elena said matter-of-factly, "plus the penthouse, the house in the Hamptons, and your personal belongings, obviously." Sarah stared at the numbers on the page. $400 million. More money than she could have imagined in her middle-class Detroit childhood. Money that came with the price of 5 years of psychological abuse and manipulation. What about Nextech? "Michael Carter has agreed to buy out David's legitimate shares at fair market value, another $100 million paid over 5 years. He wants to distance the company from David's criminal activities." Elena leaned back in her chair. "Sarah, you're about to become one of the wealthiest women in Seattle. Are you prepared for that?" Sarah looked down at her swollen belly. "I'm prepared to raise this baby without fear. Everything else is secondary." "Speaking of the baby," Elena said carefully, "David's parental rights will likely be terminated given his criminal conviction. But that's something we'll handle after the birth." A knock at the door interrupted them. Elena's secretary entered with a young woman Sarah recognized immediately. "Jessica," Sarah said, struggling to stand. "I was hoping to see you." Jessica looked different than she had at the gala, without the dramatic lighting and formal setting. She looked younger, more vulnerable. She wore simple jeans and a hospital ID badge clipped to her shirt. "I wanted to make sure you were okay," Jessica said. "And to give you this." She handed Sarah a thick manila envelope. Inside were dozens of photographs spanning years of younger Jessica at school events, graduations, birthdays, all the milestones David had missed. "I thought," Jessica said hesitantly, "if you wanted to know about David's first family, about who I am, these might help." Sarah's eyes filled with tears as she looked through the images. Jessica as a gap-toothed 8-year-old holding a science fair trophy. Jessica at 13, awkward in braces, at what looked like a school dance. Jessica at 18, beautiful in a graduation cap, with an older woman who must have been her mother. "She's lovely," Sarah said, pointing to the woman. "Your mother..." "She was," Jessica said softly. She always hoped David would come back, that he'd realize what he was missing. She died still believing he was a good man who had just lost his way. Elena tactfully excused herself, leaving the two women alone. "I have to ask," Sarah said. "Why are you being so kind to me?" You could hate me for taking your father's attention, for being part of the life that replaced you. Jessica sat down across from her, looking tired. Because you're not responsible for his choices. You're just another woman he tried to destroy when you became inconvenient. She paused, studying her hands. And because that baby you're carrying is my half-sibling, the only family I have left. The words hung in the air between them. Sarah realized that Jessica had not just been seeking justice. She had been trying to save the family she had never been allowed to have. What happens now? Sarah asked. David's lawyers are negotiating a plea deal. 25 years minimum. Probably more. He'll never get out while he's young enough to hurt anyone else. Sarah felt a strange mix of relief and sadness. Relief that her nightmare was truly over. Sadness for the man David might have been if he had chosen differently. Ashley, cooperating with federal investigators in exchange for immunity, turns out she documented everything, thinking it would protect her if things went bad. She was smarter than David gave her credit for. Jessica pulled out another envelope, this one smaller. There's something else. David wrote you a letter from jail. The guards asked me to deliver it. Sarah took the envelope but didn't open it immediately. She wasn't sure she was ready to hear from the man who had tried to destroy her. You don't have to read it now, Jessica said gently. Or ever, if you don't want to. Sarah nodded, tucking the letter into her purse. What about you? What happens to Jessica Reynolds now that justice is done? Jessica smiled for the first time since Sarah had met her. I'm thinking about medical school. Turns out I have a trust fund from my mother's life insurance that David never knew about. Enough to pay for school and support myself while I figure out what kind of doctor I want to be. That's wonderful, Sarah said, meaning it. And I was hoping, Jessica said hesitantly, when the baby comes, if you're okay with it, maybe I could be part of their life, not as a replacement for David, but as family, as an aunt. Sarah felt tears spilling down her cheeks. The baby kicked as if responding to the emotional moment. I would love that, she whispered. This baby deserves to know their family history, the good parts and the bad, and they deserve to know their sister. Jessica's eyes brightened with unshed tears. Sister, I like that. As they talked, Sarah realized that David's greatest failure hadn't been his crimes or his betrayals. It had been his inability to recognize the value of the people who loved him. He had thrown away a daughter's devotion, a wife's loyalty, and a chance to build something meaningful with his wealth and influence. But his blindness had become their strength. Jessica had found the family she had always wanted, and Sarah had found an ally she never knew she needed. 3 days later, Sarah's water broke at 2 a.m. She called Jessica first, then Elena, then the car service that would take her to Seattle General Hospital. As contractions began in earnest, she realized she felt something she hadn't experienced in months, excitement rather than fear. Jessica met her at the hospital entrance, still wearing scrubs from her shift in the IT department. How are you feeling? She asked as they walked toward the labor and delivery ward. Scared, Sarah admitted. But good scared, if that makes sense. It makes perfect sense, Jessica said. You're about to meet your son. The doctors had confirmed it was a boy through the latest ultrasound. Sarah had already chosen a name, James, after her father who had died when she was 20. James Reynolds, though she was considering changing their last name to Mitchell. Her maiden name, a fresh start for both of them. Labor progressed slowly but steadily. Jessica stayed by her side, holding her hand during contractions, helping her breathe through the pain. Elena arrived mid-morning with updates about the legal proceedings. David's plea hearing is scheduled for next week, she reported quietly while Sarah rested between contractions. The prosecutors are confident he'll accept the deal rather than risk trial. How long? Sarah asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know. 30 years minimum, Elena said. He'll be 70 when he gets out, assuming he serves the full sentence. Sarah nodded, surprised by how little the news affected her. David had become abstract to her, a problem that had been solved rather than a person she had once loved. Another contraction hit, stronger this time, and Jessica squeezed her hand. "You're doing great," she said. "He's almost here." The next few hours blurred together in a haze of pain, exhaustion, and anticipation. Sarah had taken natural childbirth classes, determined to experience every moment of bringing her son into the world. She wanted to be fully present for his arrival, not numbed by drugs or distracted by fear. As the sun began to set through the hospital room window, Dr. Patterson announced that it was time to push. Jessica moved to support Sarah's shoulders while the medical team prepared for delivery. "I can see his head," Dr. Patterson called out. "One more big push. Sarah." Sarah bore down with all her remaining strength, and suddenly the room filled with a baby's cries. Strong, healthy, angry cries that announced to the world that James Mitchell Reynolds had arrived. "He's perfect," Dr. Patterson said, lifting the baby for Sarah to see. 8 pounds, 4 ounces, and very upset about being evicted. They placed James on Sarah's chest immediately, and she looked down at her son for the first time. He was red-faced and wrinkled, his hair dark and damp, his tiny fists waving indignantly. But he was beautiful. He was hers, and he was safe. "Hello, baby boy," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I'm your mama." Jessica was crying too, her hand resting gently on the baby's back. "He looks like you," she said softly. "Thank goodness." Sarah laughed through her tears. "I was so afraid he'd look like David." "He looks like himself," Jessica said firmly. "Like James. Like a little person who gets to write his own story." As the medical team cleaned and examined James, Sarah realized that this moment represented everything David had tried to take from her: her autonomy, her strength, her right to protect her child. Instead, she was surrounded by people who supported her, holding a healthy baby who would never know his father's cruelty. Elena appeared at her bedside with a small gift bag. "From the office," she said with a smile. "We thought James might need his first legal document." Inside was a birth certificate application with James's name already filled in, and beneath it, papers to legally change both their surnames to Mitchell. "If you want to," Elena said. "No pressure." Sarah looked down at her son, now sleeping peacefully in her arms. James Mitchell had a nice ring to it, a name that belonged only to him, with no shadows from his father's crimes. "Yes," she said firmly. "James Mitchell. We start fresh." Jessica squeezed her shoulder gently. "Welcome to the world, James Mitchell. Your mom is amazing, and you're going to have a wonderful life." As night fell over Seattle, Sarah held her son and felt something she hadn't experienced since before her marriage: complete peace. David was in prison. His empire had crumbled, and his ability to hurt them was gone forever. But more than that, she had built something new from the ashes of her old life: a family that chose to be together, bound not by blood or obligation, but by love and mutual respect. James stirred in her arms, making soft baby sounds, and Sarah realized that this was what happiness felt like. Not the desperate joy of survival, but the quiet contentment of safety, love, and hope for the future. 6 months after James's birth, Sarah stood in the lobby of the Seattle Children's Hospital, watching construction workers install a bronze plaque that read the Jessica Reynolds Pediatric Technology Wing, donated by the Mitchell Family Foundation. James gurgled happily in his carrier, reaching for the bright lights overhead. At 6 months old, he was a cheerful baby with Sarah's brown eyes and an infectious smile that had charmed everyone from the mailman to the hospital board of directors. "It's beautiful," Jessica said, joining them after finishing her shift. She had started medical school the previous month but still worked part-time at the hospital to maintain her health insurance. "It's a start," Sarah said. "I want to make sure David's money does some good in the world." The foundation had been Elena's idea. Rather than simply living off the money from David's empire, Sarah had decided to use her wealth purposefully. The technology wing would provide state-of-the-art computer systems for pediatric patients, allowing them to continue their education and stay connected with friends while receiving treatment. "Have you decided about the other projects?" Jessica asked as they walked through the hospital corridors. Sarah nodded. "The domestic violence shelter in Detroit. My hometown could use the resources, and it feels right to help women who are trapped the way I was." They had also funded a legal aid clinic specializing in prenuptial agreement disputes, and Sarah was considering a scholarship program for single mothers pursuing higher education. "The reporter from Seattle Magazine wants to interview you next week," Elena said, joining them in the hospital cafeteria. "The story about your transformation has captured national attention." Sarah winced slightly. The media coverage had been intense, with headlines like "From Victim to Victor, Sarah Mitchell's Billion-Dollar Justice" appearing in magazines and newspapers across the country. Publishers were offering seven-figure advances for her memoir. "I'm still not comfortable with the attention," Sarah admitted. "I don't want to be known as David Reynolds' ex-wife forever." "You won't be," Jessica said firmly. "Give it time. Right now, you're news because of what happened to you. Eventually, you'll be news because of what you accomplish." Sarah looked down at James, who was chewing on a teething ring with serious concentration. "I want him to grow up knowing that his mother stood up for herself and for other people. I want that to be normal for him." "Speaking of standing up," Elena said with a sly smile, "Michael Carter called. Nextech's board wants to offer you a position." "What kind of position?" "Vice President of Corporate Ethics. Overseeing transparency initiatives and employee advocacy programs." Sarah considered this. She had been thinking about returning to work, but most offers felt like charity or curiosity about the woman who had brought down David Reynolds. This sounded different. It would be part-time initially. Elena continued, "Michael understands you have a baby and other commitments, but he thinks your perspective could help them rebuild their corporate culture." "I'll think about it," Sarah said. Later that evening, in the quiet of their new home overlooking Puget Sound, Sarah read David's letter for the first time. She had carried it in her purse for months, unopening it until she felt strong enough to handle whatever it contained. The letter was shorter than she had expected Sarah. "I know you'll never forgive me, and you shouldn't. What I did to you was unforgivable. I told myself I was protecting my interests, but the truth is, I was just afraid of losing control. I'm not writing to ask for forgiveness or to make excuses. I'm writing because you deserve to know that what happened wasn't your fault. You were never weak or crazy or insufficient. You were just married to someone who didn't deserve you. Take care of our son. Raise him to be better than his father." Sarah folded the letter and put it in James's baby book. Someday, when he was old enough to understand, he could read his father's words and make his own decisions about forgiveness and family. For now, it was enough that David acknowledged what he had done, even if it was too late to matter. Jessica arrived for dinner with Chinese takeout and news from the courthouse. "David's sentencing hearing is next week," The prosecutors think he'll get the full 30 years. Will you go? Sarah asked. Jessica shook her head. I got my justice when the FBI arrested him. I don't need to watch him be sentenced to feel closure. They ate dinner on Sarah's deck, watching the sunset paint Elliott Bay in shades of gold and pink. James sat in his high chair, alternately eating mashed bananas and smearing them on his tray with obvious delight. I have an announcement, Jessica said as they cleaned up. I got into the pediatric residency program at Children's Hospital. Sarah hugged her tightly. Jessica, that's wonderful. When do you start next summer, after I finish my first year of medical school? Dr. Patterson wrote me a recommendation letter citing my exceptional character and dedication to justice. She grinned. Apparently bringing down a federal criminal looks good on applications. As they talked, Sarah realized how much her life had changed in less than a year. She had gone from a terrified, isolated pregnant woman to a confident mother with a purpose, surrounded by people who valued her for who she was rather than what she could provide. The fear that had controlled her marriage was gone, replaced by the quiet confidence that came from surviving the worst and discovering she was stronger than she had ever imagined. I've been thinking about Michael's job offer, Sarah said as Jessica prepared to leave. I think I'm going to take it. Really? What changed your mind? Sarah looked at James, now drowsy in his bouncer, his little fist wrapped around her finger. I want him to see his mother working, contributing, making decisions that matter. I want him to know that's normal. Jessica smiled. He's going to be proud of you, just like I am. After Jessica left, Sarah sat on her deck holding James as he fell asleep. The city lights twinkled below them, and she could hear the distant sound of ferries crossing the Sound. This was happiness, she realized, not the desperate relief of escape, but the deep contentment of safety, purpose, and love. David was in prison, but that wasn't what made her happy. Jessica was family, but that wasn't what made her complete. James was healthy and beautiful, but even he wasn't the source of her peace. What made her happy was the knowledge that she had chosen this life. Every decision, from leaving David to starting the foundation to considering the job offer, was hers to make. For the first time in years, Sarah Reynolds Mitchell was truly free. 1 year later, Sarah stood at the podium of the Seattle Convention Center, looking out at an audience of 500 women attending the first annual Rise Above conference. The event brought together domestic violence survivors, legal advocates, and business leaders to share resources and support. James, now 18 months old and walking everywhere, sat in the front row with Jessica, babbling happily and occasionally calling out "Mama" when he spotted Sarah on the stage. A year ago, Sarah began, her voice steady and clear, I was 7 months pregnant, isolated, and convinced I had no options. My husband controlled every aspect of my life, and I believed I was trapped forever. She paused, making eye contact with women throughout the audience. Some faces showed recognition, others skepticism, but all were listening intently. I was wrong about being trapped, but I was right about one thing I couldn't escape alone. The women who saved me were Elena Vasquez, who risked her career to represent me, and Jessica Reynolds, who spent 3 years building a case against the man who had abandoned her. Jessica waved from the front row, earning applause from the audience. Today, I want to talk about the difference between surviving and thriving. Sarah continued, Surviving means getting through each day, enduring whatever comes your way, hoping things might eventually get better. I survived my marriage for 5 years. She clicked to the next slide, showing a photograph of herself from David's sentencing hearing. She looked tired but determined, holding James in her arms. Thriving means making choices that align with your values, building relationships based on mutual respect, and using your experiences to help others. I've spent the past year learning how to thrive. The audience was completely silent now, hanging on every word. The Mitchell Family Foundation has funded 3 domestic violence shelters, 2 legal aid clinics, and a technology program that helps isolated women access resources and support. We've done this because surviving isn't enough. We want to help women thrive. Sarah clicked to another slide showing statistics about domestic violence and financial abuse. The numbers were staggering, but she had learned to present them without being overwhelmed by the scope of the problem. My ex-husband is serving 30 years in federal prison for embezzlement and tax evasion. His crimes against me were legal, hidden behind a prenuptial agreement I signed when I was young and trusting. But his financial crimes gave us the leverage we needed to break free. She paused, looking down at James, who was now standing on his chair and clapping enthusiastically. That little boy will grow up knowing his mother stood up for herself and for others. He'll never think it's normal for men to control or intimidate women. He'll never believe that marriage means sacrificing your identity or your dreams. The audience erupted into applause, but Sarah wasn't finished. I also want him to know his sister Jessica, who taught me that justice isn't about revenge. It's about ensuring that people who abuse their power face consequences, and that their victims get the support they need to rebuild their lives. Jessica stood up in the front row, tears streaming down her face, and the audience gave her a standing ovation. This conference exists because none of us should have to fight these battles alone. Sarah continued when the applause died down. Whether you're trying to leave an abusive relationship, rebuild after divorce, or simply want to help other women, this community is here for you. She concluded with the foundation's motto, "We rise together, or we don't rise at all." After her speech, Sarah was surrounded by women wanting to share their stories, ask for advice, or volunteer with the foundation. She listened to each one, remembering how desperate she had felt for someone to understand what she was experiencing. Elena found her during a break. James balanced on her hip while he ate a cookie. "Excellent speech," Elena said. "The board of directors is impressed with the foundation's impact already." "It's just the beginning," Sarah said. "I've been thinking about expanding to other cities, maybe starting a national network." And the book, Sarah had finally decided to write her memoir, but she was taking her time with it. "I want to make sure I tell the whole story, not just the dramatic parts. The years of small compromises that led up to the crisis. The way isolation made me doubt my own perception of reality. The long process of rebuilding confidence and trust." Jessica joined them with James, who immediately reached for his mother. "Up, Mama," he demanded, and Sarah lifted him into her arms. "How does it feel?" Jessica asked, being the keynote speaker instead of the person hiding in the back of the room. Sarah considered the question seriously. Terrifying and exhilarating. A year ago, I couldn't imagine speaking in public about anything, let alone my personal life. Now I feel like I have something important to say. "You do," Elena said firmly. "Every woman in that audience saw herself in your story, but they also saw proof that escape and recovery are possible." As the day continued, Sarah met with foundation board members, potential donors, and other speakers. The work was demanding but deeply satisfying. She was using her privilege and resources to address problems she understood intimately. That evening, at the foundation's donor reception, Michael Carter approached her with news about Nextech. "The ethics program you designed is being adopted by 3 other tech companies," he said. "The employee advocacy position you created has prevented 2 potential harassment cases from escalating." Sarah smiled. I'm glad it's working. It feels good to use my business skills for something meaningful. There's something else, Michael said. The board wants to offer you a full partnership in the company, not because of your settlement money or your story, but because of the work you've done this past year. Sarah was stunned. A partnership, 20% equity, full voting rights, and the authority to expand the ethics program company-wide. You'd be one of the most powerful women in Seattle tech. Sarah looked across the room at James, who was charming a group of Foundation supporters while Jessica kept him from destroying the appetizer table. I need time to think about it, she said. James is still so young, and the Foundation needs attention. Of course, Michael said. But Sarah, you've earned this, not because of what David did to you, but because of what you've accomplished despite it. Later that night, after the guests had gone home and James was asleep, Sarah sat on her deck with Jessica, sharing a bottle of wine and processing the events of the day. Are you going to take the partnership? Jessica asked. I think so, Sarah said. It feels right, like the next step in building something meaningful. Mom would be proud of you, Jessica said quietly. Both of you. What you've built from the ashes of David's destruction. Sarah looked up at the stars, visible despite the city lights. Do you think about him? Sometimes, I wonder if he's learned anything, if he regrets what he did. But mostly, I just feel grateful that his selfishness led us to each other. Sarah nodded. I used to hate him for what he put me through. Now I realize that his betrayal gave me the push I needed to discover who I really was underneath all the fear. James stirred on the baby monitor, making sleepy sounds, and Sarah smiled. I should check on him. I'll come with you, Jessica said. They stood in the doorway of James's nursery, watching him sleep. He had grown so much since his birth, developing his own personality and preferences. He was fearless, curious, and affectionate, showing no signs of the trauma that had surrounded his earliest months. He's going to have a good life, Jessica said softly. The best life, Sarah agreed. He'll grow up knowing he's loved, knowing his voice matters, knowing he has choices. As they turned to leave, James opened his eyes and smiled at them sleepily. Mama, Jess, go back to sleep, baby, Sarah whispered, but she was smiling. He had recently started calling Jessica by name, accepting her as a permanent part of their family. This was what victory looked like. Sarah realized, not the dramatic courtroom scenes or the headlines about David's downfall, but these quiet moments of love and security. A child who slept peacefully. A sister who chose to stay. A life built on truth instead of fear. David had tried to convince her that she was nothing without him. Instead, she had discovered that she was everything she needed to be, and that her son would grow up knowing the same truth. The betrayed wife who had brought a lawyer to the family meeting had become something far more powerful, a woman who had chosen to rise above her circumstances and help others do the same, and that, Sarah knew, was a legacy worth building.